to the ascendance of Gothic architecture in the 12th and 13th centuries, and then to 14th century European art on the cusp of what will become the Renaissance. You will only taste the seeds of the Renaissance here, but if you take the second section of art history, you will have the chance to find out how the artists in the 15th and 16th centuries build upon the artists you will see today. Gothic architecture starts in Paris. Gothic architecture is a Northern European style rather than a Southern European style, not so much Italy, more France. At the same time, this architecture popular in the 12th and 13th centuries, was simply called the French style. At that time, it wasn't called Gothic. It was called the French style because that's where it was from. But later, Giorgio Vasari, a historian writing in the 16th century, used the term Gothic to refer to this so-called French style. Vasari called this architecture Gothic because it was Germanic. If you remember from Roman times, the time of the Roman Empire, Goths came down from the north, the German regions where Germany is now, and sacked Rome. So Gothic architecture at the time of this historian Vasari was already old-fashioned, and so the term Gothic is actually a pejorative term, and if you remember the Goths invading Rome, that wasn't such a pleasant thing. So the Italians looked down upon the Goths. And the first Gothic building is Saint-Denis, pictured here, the church of the Benedictine Abbey in France. And Saint-Denis was extremely wealthy. The kings of France were buried here. The first Gothic church was started in the 1330s here. And it has many features that are already present, that have been already present in Romanesque buildings. We saw Romanesque architecture last week. So given that many features of Saint-Denis were already present in Romanesque times, what, we might ask, makes Saint-Denis Gothic? What makes this building particularly Gothic? Why is it the first Gothic building? So Saint-Denis had an apse surrounded by an ambulatory with radiating chapels. You can see here that this Romanesque church, such as St. James, also already had an apse with little radiating chapels here and here and here. So it can't be that makes it uniquely Gothic. Saint-Denis also has pointed arches, which we already saw in Gothic buildings such as the Abbey Church of Notre Dame de Fontenay. Saint-Denis has buttressing, external buttressing, but that was an innovation that we saw during the Romanesque period. And so we ask again, why was Saint-Denis the first Gothic building? What made it uniquely Gothic? What makes Saint-Denis Gothic is light. Saint-Denis achieves, by using features already present in Romanesque architecture, it achieves a flowing, open, light-filled space. I'll speak more about how this light-filled space is achieved, but for now, just know that Abbot Suger, the abbot at the Abbey of Saint-Denis, was able to employ non-load-bearing walls. And the reason that it's so essential to have walls that are not load-bearing, walls that are not bearing weight, is that it allows him to incorporate much more stained glass than ever. So Gothic cathedrals differ from those built in the Romanesque period in their shift toward more open, light-filled space. But if a wall needs to bear weight, of course, the amount of stained glass must be limited because glass cannot bear weight. If the weight is taken off the walls and distributed elsewhere, then the architect is free to make walls of glass. And of course, glass lets in light, and light is the key here. So this is the true innovation of the Gothic style. So non-load-bearing walls filled with stained glass were an architectural element of the choir at the Abbey Church of Saint-Denis, introduced at the time of Abbot Suger's redesign. So stained glass is the kind of monumental painting of this time. Instead of large murals or mosaics, we saw a lot of mosaics with gold in other churches in this course. This French style, this French Gothic style, uses stained glass as its expressive medium, as its form of painting in a way. They didn't have television or film, but this was, for them, a similar experience. So Abbot Suger advocated for the glory and the lavish beauty of the church, and his desire is to glorify God as well as to glorify the kings buried in his church. But this is a markedly different argument than that made by Bernard of Clairvaux, who was writing at the same time. If you remember this slide from the previous lecture, Bernard of Clairvaux, from the same century, was not having the sumptuousness of the church. He said, "Tell me, O poor men, if you really are poor men, why is there gold in the holy place? The walls of the church are aglow, but the poor of the church go hungry. The stones of the church are covered with gold, while its children are naked." So he's not so convinced by the beauty of church architecture. So what's Abbot Suger's argument then in support of the glory of architecture, of the architectural program that he implemented? We know that Abbot Suger's primary goal, based on his reading of religious texts by the theologian Pseudo-Dionysius, was to fill the church with light. And Pseudo-Dionysius speaks of God as light, and God creates the whole world, according to Pseudo-Dionysius, and the whole world is thus filled with God's light, because God is creating it. And in this way, contemplating light allows a person to be lifted up to God. So Suger is obsessed with light because the contemplation of light is a way of contemplating the light of God that fills all things. That is to say, just as light from the sun comes through stained glass, the light of God shines through the whole of creation. So here you can kind of see the way that the light comes through the stained glass. You don't see the light directly, but you see an impression of it. So Suger uses imagery referencing light. He says, when he speaks about his work, "Bright is the noble work, but being nobly bright, the work should brighten the minds, so that they may travel through the true lights, to the true light where Christ is the true door." So this bright, light-filled artwork can help the mind travel to the light of Christ. The mind travels from the material to the immaterial. The material beauty of this church makes it possible for the mind to travel to the light of God. So there's this connection. You see the beauty of the church, and it allows your mind to travel to the true light of Christ. And then he goes on, "In what manner it be inherent in this world, the golden door defines. The dull mind rises to truth through that which is material." And so we can all kind of think of the experience of seeing a sunset or something like that, where our dull minds are invigorated and inspired by some sort of beauty to something transcendent or something larger than ourselves. And in seeing this light is resurrected from its former submersion. So seeing the light of Christ resurrects the mind in a sense, inspires the mind. So Suger himself was inspired by Pseudo-Dionysius, as I mentioned. And Pseudo-Dionysius writes about God, the cause and harmony and splendor in all things, flashing forth before them all like light. So he says the superessential beautiful is called beauty because of that quality which it imparts to all things severally according to their nature. So basically that just means the beauty that is behind everything gives beauty to everything, imparts to everything beauty, because it is the cause of the harmony and splendor in all things. So basically he's referencing God. God is the cause of the harmony in all things and the splendor and beauty of all things. And God is also flashing forth upon them all like light. So it's the sense that no matter where you look, you are seeing the presence of God. You're seeing the light of God communicated through the creation. The beauty and communication of its originating ray. So everything we can see is communicating the light of God. And because it summons all things unto itself. So Suger's masterful vision inaugurated a new age, and there were more innovations to come. In the Cathedral of Notre Dame, a height is achieved with the use of flying buttresses. Flying buttresses help support the nave vaults by transferring their outward thrust over the aisles to massive freestanding upright external buttresses. So what does that mean? These are the flying buttresses here. And the thrust of the weight of the building is transferred down the arch to the massive upright external buttresses. The flying buttresses put the support of the building on the outside. At the same time, the skeleton that is created is not a crude, visible inner working, but it's very graceful. It's an integral, graceful part of the structure. And so what we're looking at here in Notre Dame is actually a renovation of what was done in the 13th century, so it's not exactly the original, but the same idea. was working at the time. So Notre Dame is in Paris, of course. And at this time, towns gained increasing importance. So a city like Paris was becoming more important. For one thing, a town like Paris was an important center of learning. So cities became important for that reason. And Paris was also important for some other reasons. For one thing, Paris became a major center of book production. Books were being produced in the Gothic period in Paris. And in addition to being a center of learning, St. Thomas Aquinas actually made Paris the intellectual center of Europe. So that kind of brought it up a notch. So intellectuals at this time are reading Aristotle, and Aquinas is one of these Aristotelians, and he's also a scholastic. And scholasticism emerged as a mode of thought that aimed to reconcile Christian theology with classical theology. So scholastics are bringing classical Greek and Roman philosophy to their Christian theological speculation. And Aquinas, like I said, is a scholastic. And some scholars suggest that there's a relationship between the geometric order underlying Gothic cathedrals and scholasticism, an intellectual system of thought, as I said, that attempted to reconcile Christian theology with classical philosophy. And so we've discussed the importance of light to the theology of the Gothic cathedral. I hope you didn't miss that, but light is very important to the thought process of the construction of these cathedrals. And in order to let in more light, builders of cathedrals continued to innovate, as we can see here at Rheims Cathedral. It's a relevant example. Here, the development of bar tracery is invented. Tracery is the stonework element that support Gothic windows. So all of this here is bar tracery, because in this case, plate tracery, the previous form of tracery, is the technique of cutting holes into the stone wall. But bar tracery is made up of these thin pieces of stone bars inserted into the opening in the wall. So these thin pieces are attached and inserted into this opening. And this development of bar tracery made possible even larger areas of stained glass in relation to wall surface. So once again, people were figuring out how to let in more light. And that's how you get these beautiful rose windows. Sainte-Chapelle here is one of the most exquisite examples of Gothic architecture, as you can see. And you can think of Sainte-Chapelle as an inverse jeweled reliquary box, only instead of the exterior encrusted with jewels, the interior is bejeweled through the stained glass, so you're experiencing the jewels from inside. This chapel was built under King Louis and exemplifies the court style of the mid-13th century. The lavish use of stained glass and rich materials of Sainte-Chapelle in Paris exemplifies the court style of Gothic art that emerged in Paris during the mid-13th century. It's the height of this Gothic style. So, unfortunately, the building of Gothic cathedrals frequently inspire public outrage and riots because building a cathedral required increases in commercial and feudal taxes. Obviously, the farmers did not appreciate this, and so from time to time, they revolted. So whenever we look at beautiful art, as we've looked at a lot of very sumptuous art in this course, we have to think about the question of funding. Who paid for the work that's being done, and how did the person get his or her money? More often than not, the wealth of some patrons of the arts comes at the expense of the labor of many other people who don't get to appreciate the benefits of their labor. So, of course, we see the same situation very common today. So it's just important to keep that in mind. The Gothic style, now we turn to Italy. The Gothic style was somewhat different in Italy, and the developments in Gothic sculpture are interestingly exemplified by the Pisano family. Here we have Nicola Pisano on the left and his son Giovanni on the right. Nicola Pisano was inspired by classical art, and he aimed to look at nature as a source of inspiration. So this turning toward nature will be very important in Italy as we examine the next century, the 14th century, in the next chapter. But all that to say, with Nicola Pisano, we see a relationship to Roman sarcophagi and reliefs, if you can think that far back in the course. The full body of the Virgin reclining, as you can see here, in the center of the relief, looks very classical. She could almost be mistaken for a Roman figure, Roman sculpture. and she looks like she comes off of a Roman sarcophagi. And his son, Giovanni, sarcophagus, excuse me, worked for his father. Giovanni worked for his father and then developed his own style. And his figures are much more animated. Look at how much more movement there is in the second relief. And I don't know if it's easy to tell, but for example, if you look at the Virgin here, her arm is bent, her one arm is stretched out. It's not just, attached to her body, but it's moving in space. Even her head is thrust forward. And even her back is sort of bent and curved. And the same with all the figures. They're moving a little bit more. There's more of a sense of curve and movement rather than solidity. And the figures are more active. Now we turn from the Gothic period to the 14th century. And as we look at the 14th century, we will focus more closely on Italy. A lot is going on in Italy in the world of art. New things are beginning to take place, and the work that we will see in this lecture is considered to be proto-Renaissance, or the very beginning of what would become Renaissance art. So if you're interested in the Renaissance, in Michelangelo and Leonardo, you might consider taking the next section of art history. But keep in mind right now that we're looking at the beginning of what would influence those artists. We're not going to get to them this time, but you can see some influences, some people who influence them. So in the 14th century, there was economic growth and a flourishing of culture, but there were also a series of crises. France and England are engaged in the 100 Years' War, and the plague, or the Black Death, came to Europe from the east and decimated 40% of the population, in some places up to 80%. This created social upheaval. For example, rent became very low after this because landlords could no longer find tenants because everyone had died. It also changed the structure of society, allowing some people to take on new positions, so maybe allowing for some more freedom. During the 14th century, artists who were employed learned their skills through an apprenticeship system. They would work for masters to learn their trade, and they were part of guilds, which functioned basically as extended families. Artists were still supported by patrons who determined the vision of the art. So artists had to create what they were told to make. So their patrons determined the vision and sometimes the subject matter and even sometimes the style of their work. And now, along with the church, wealthy merchants are supporting the arts. So the next point here. Merchants were similar to the church in that they created contracts determining the subject matter and sometimes even the look of art. But at the same time, even though obviously the patron system is alive and well, artists began to emerge as individuals, a sociological change that may have encouraged the innovative developments of Italian art in the 14th century. If the artist is an individual, the artist can develop a unique style distinct from other masterworks that came before. So that's why individualism can really impact what's happening in art. Innovations, finally, in 14th century painting were comparable to shifts that occurred in the period's literature. Dante, you may have heard of, wrote the Divine Comedy in Italian because more people were able to read and enjoy literature. So his Divine Comedy is centered on a journey through heaven and hell, led by Virgil, who's an ancient pagan rather than a Christian. This emphasis on classical motifs is important, although Dante's Divine Comedy is still a book about revelation, so we haven't gone to a secular age at all at this point. At the same time, in the literature of the 14th century, a greater emphasis was placed on observable elements of human experience. Writers observe the world around them and write about what they see. So Dante describes the political and social situations of the world around him. In the same way, painters are beginning to observe the world around them. And the observable world is becoming a source for their work. And this is a profound shift. This means that writers and artists are shifting from the invisible world to the visible world. And this shift to the realm of observation becomes the basis for modern science. But before we get to this shift, before we see the artists who start observing the world in order to create their art, we need to take a step back to Cimabue, who's working in Florence. This painting is made of tempera. Italian painters in the 14th and 15th centuries worked principally in tempera, a paint made from powdered pigments, often mixed with egg yolk, water, and an occasional touch of glue. And the style Cimabue is using for this altarpiece is called the Greek style, or Maniera Greca. It is the Byzantine style, which is very influential at this time. It's the Greek style. The Italians were influenced by the Greeks, and this formal pose of the Virgin is popular in Byzantine iconography. So you can see her hand gesturing toward her son, who is the savior of the world. In addition, the folds of her dress are outlined in gold, highlighted in gold. And Cimabue also has an interesting sense of space. He shows the prophets at the base frontally, so they're facing us straight on, but we can see the Virgin's lap from above, as well as the architectural setting. It looks as if we're looking at it from above. And so there's not one consistent vantage point, but multiple. Giotto di Bondone is a student of Cimabue, but his work makes a break with the past, as we can see in this image. And he is, in fact, considered by scholars to be the father of Western painting. Like I said, he will be somebody who's turning more to the observational, to an observation of the world, and he becomes extremely influential in the Renaissance. And so why is his work so revolutionary? First of all, Giotto's work is very divergent from the Byzantine style. In fact, he rejects the Byzantine style of his teacher Cimabue. He returns to naturalism as a return to classical art, as we saw with the Pisanos. He employs modeling to create three-dimensionality in his figures. So what do we mean by modeling? The term modeling refers to the use of light and dark pigment tones, which allows artists to simulate three-dimensional forms in painted pictures. So obviously a picture is flat, but if you use dark under the chin, you can tell that there's a sense of a shape there. And if you have light highlights, that also gives you a sense of form and modeling. So with the sense of modeling in the construction of his figures, Giotto also pays attention to the context in which these fully embodied figures are situated. So the space around them becomes really important. They no longer float in space from multiple vantage points, but he describes these spaces almost as stage sets. He's influenced by the stage. And we'll look at that a little bit later. Most of all, Giotto turns to an observation of nature, as I said, a development we mentioned is central to literature at the time. And artists are also observing nature, using their eyes, prioritizing sight, and beginning, in effect, the age of scientific observation, when sight and observation become really important, which leads to the developments that lead to the life that we enjoy at this point now. So Giotto's Virgin and Child Enthroned, we can see here, has the same symmetrical composition as Cimabue's composition, but Giotto's differs from Cimabue's earlier version of the same subject because his figures appear as solid, blocky forms. Mary's dress does not have gold delineating its folds. You see, gone are the gold lines here. Oops, excuse me. No, gone are the gold lines. Her body looks solid. It's three-dimensional. And on her solid lap sits Christ. And Mary holds his leg in a much more naturalistic pose. So now moving to the next slide, the Scrovegni Chapel. I mentioned the importance of merchants in this time period as patrons of the arts, as well as the influence patrons still had on the works that artists made. Patrons helped decide what the artists could do or not do. And in the case of the Scrovegni Chapel, a rich merchant commissions a chapel in part because he feels guilty for the ways in which he gained his wealth. In order to make his image look better, he asks that the story of Mary visiting Elizabeth be on the opposite side of the archway, kind of like reflected, by the depiction of Judas receiving payment to betray Jesus. So the intention is to organize the narratives on either sides of the doorway to create symmetrical pairings between paintings. And those symmetrical pairings encourage viewers to relate biblical events one to another. So in this case, they relate the biblical event of the visitation to accepting money, something obviously on the mind of Enrico Scrovegni. The building itself, its architecture, is nothing extraordinary, nothing too unique, and the placement of Giotto's frescoes are really not necessarily complementing the building. It's really just flat walls that serve as his canvas. What Giotto does do in these frescoes is distill complex narratives into compelling moments and emphasizes the human emotion of these moments through the details of the paintings that he does. So now we can look at a detail or one of his paintings. Human emotion is important, and it's in his painting, and it's a very important part of the highly influential Franciscan order. Franciscans are the first mendicants. It's the first mendicant order of monks. Mendicants are traveling beggars. And Francis encouraged personal devotion and an emotional reaction to the stories of the Bible. So this influential movement swept through Europe and really connected people to their faith and was widely popular. The Franciscans emphasized dramatic narratives as a way for the faithful to enter the stories. So the dramatic narratives help activate people's emotions and connect their emotions to the stories of the Bible. Giotto is probably influenced by these performances. So the Franciscans would perform narrative from the Bible, and they'd have stages for this to happen. And in a similar sense, Giotto is creating a stage set with a dramatic narrative being performed on that stage. His emphasis on human empathy and emotion probably came from his exposure to the Franciscans, who also emphasized emotion. And he includes the range of human emotions. Multiple different emotions on the faces of multiple different people. So emotion's very important. These guys here are kind of standing on the side with a solemn sadness. There's a fierce grief of Mary here. And people dramatically moving their hands or crying out as these little angels are doing. So multiplicity of human emotions, which are a testament to his close observation of human experience. Remember, we're talking about the turn towards observing the natural world. So we're beginning to see an observation of the natural world and a depiction of the drama of everyday life in painting. The compositions Giotto constructs are constructed like stage plays. In addition to the use of modeling to construct his figures, he also creates a sense of depth in the picture similar to that of a stage. And what's interesting here, so he does create a sense of depth. Like I said, the context is just as important to him as the solid figures that he's portraying. And this detail of 4 panels side by side shows the way he made the paintings connect with one another. So you have a mountain that kind of curves over here, and also a mountain line, the line of this mountain that continues up into this corner. From the lamentation to the raising of Lazarus, connecting those stories visually, your eye moves through the space. Giotto and his teacher Cimabue were both part of the tradition of art coming out of Florence. I mentioned that Cimabue was from Florence. They're part of the Florentine tradition, and Florence had a rival, and the rival city-state was Siena. Now we turn from Florence to Siena. An artist at work in Siena, his name is Duccio di Buoninsegna. Sienese art is more rooted in the Byzantine tradition that Giotto rejected. So remember, Cimabue was part of the Byzantine tradition, and so is Duccio. Duccio synthesized the Byzantine with the French Gothic. He painted a huge altarpiece, shown here, for the high altar of Siena Cathedral. This Maesta was dismantled and can only be reconstructed through conjecture. So this reconstruction of all these different pieces together is only a guess. Dramatic narratives are also present here, especially in the back of the altarpiece, where Duccio included stories from the life of Christ. And on the front, The figures are wearing the latest fashion in expensive textiles. So we'll see the importance of textile in the future in this lecture. Linear elegance and courtly prominence were displayed in the Annunciation by Simone Martini and Lippo Memmi. The cloth behind Gabriel indicates that Gabriel has just landed by its curvilinear movement, so it's quite a dramatic curve here. Adding to the dynamic relationship between Gabriel and Mary is Mary's body language. She holds up her cloak and turns her body away from Gabriel. So she's turning away from him, basically. And there's a kind of a large space between them. And in this space is incised scriptural text into the gold leaf to convey that the angel is speaking to Mary. After all, this is the Annunciation, the moment when Gabriel tells Mary the news that she will be the mother of Jesus. I mentioned the importance of textiles, sumptuous textiles that are imported. The practice of embroidery using colored silk and gold thread was an art developed by the English and made famous all over the world, so they were masters of this art. Its fame led to the moniker Opus Anglicanum, or English work. Imagine the importance of a person wearing such a garment. It's been stitched by hand with gold. A priest would wear this during the liturgy, and the gold would glitter in the candlelight, and some cloaks and other adornments, in fact, would become so heavy that people had trouble walking in them. Finally, we focused on the flourishing of art and literature and the important innovations that are happening in the 13th century in all of Europe, and the 14th century, But throughout Europe, the Black Death swept through the population and killed many people, up to 80% of the population in certain places. But no part of Europe, and no part of Europe was left unscathed by this plague. Death was everywhere, and there was no one to bury the bodies. They had no idea how this disease even spread. So it was terrifying. So the plague, the Black Death, is one factor that contributed to the mystical religiosity in Germany during the 14th century. This mystical sense of religion inspired images emphasizing both ecstatic joy and extreme suffering. Suffering pervades this Pietà from Germany around 1330. Mary and Jesus have emaciated bodies and grim, grief-stricken, obviously suffering faces. The blood oozes from Christ's wounds, as you can see here. There's just a sadness to their very thin and sick-looking bodies. So, on that note, what we've seen in these chapters is basically a hint of what is to come in subsequent centuries in Europe. Although you will have to continue studying art history to find out what happens in the Renaissance and to find out more about how Renaissance artists take up the themes that we've seen in this period and turn them into new and exciting territory.